I certainly add my thank you to yours for all of the volunteers in not only the music camp, but Vacation Bible School and the Disciple Now program that took place last week. They were great successes, and that's not a given. And they are great successes mostly because of the intense volunteer effort on the part of this congregation in terms of making it happen. I was blessed to be here this week, and the thing I'm clearest about is I didn't do it. They did it. Well, the Holy Spirit did it, but it's full of power and energy. Vacation Bible School, as I think I said last Sunday, is a mystery to me because it's over 100 years old now as an institution, and it's very ecumenical. It's across denominations. It's one of the things that is really a gift of the American church to the church around the world. It's present in many other countries now. And listen, when you find Kim Carswell and Alexa Parker saying that they're willing to be the VBS leaders again, we should stand up and sing the Hallelujah chorus together. I wonder if we know, Christian education researchers know, that these kinds of events, like week-long activities in the church, like Vacation Bible School, and trips, like the senior high are going off on now, we know that these are historically disproportionately impactful on nurturing faith in people. They know this through research, where they research adults and ask them to reflect on what were the formative experiences in their faith. And these intense events always come out as very frequent flyers this way. And I wonder if there are adults here, particularly if you're in the category of older adult, if any of you remember your Vacation Bible School experiences. See, that's pretty powerful, all right? So not only do I remember mine, but I brought the artifacts here today. What does it mean that I still have these, except in some way it was deeply important to me? I don't know if you can see from there, but these are the 10 Commandments. I made them in Vacation Bible School. Now, these are not the actual commandments, but these are my replica of them. And part of the reason I kept them is because they outline in 2 words each commandment. It's been a helpful memorization tool for me across the years, but I think it also reminds me of how faith is always given to us as a gift, and it comes so much through the volunteer efforts of others who put their energy and their time and their own faith into it, and I'm grateful for that here. One of the other excellent resources that is available at this church in terms of nurturing faith are recorded Bible studies. The one on Tuesday morning I highlight now. They call it the Lectionary Podcast, but you can see the video recording on our website or our YouTube page, and you can also download the podcast from Spotify or iTunes. I think I'm at the point when people quote something they've read that's theologically meaningful to me, they're as likely to be quoting it from a podcast they've listened to as they are a book. That happens somewhere in my adult journey, all right? A tipping point in there, and it's fairly recently. But this podcast on Tuesday mornings they record, and it's up the rest of the week, is almost always of the gospel reading for the Sunday coming. And there are 3 scholars that record it. It's usually the Reverend John Ryder and the Reverend Bill Hall, and also Sarah Mickelson, a fine teacher. It was founded by really Don Upton, who was the original, I think, in bringing that forward. And it's been a wonderful ministry for maybe 15 years now. And remember Will Wellman's hand in getting it started. How grateful we are. It's an excellent, about 40 minutes long resource about studying the Bible together as you hear these 3 friends. And sometimes they bring in a ringer. Once in a while they let me be a part of it. Reflect just openly about what the passage means to them. And I'm very dependent on them this week for the content of my sermon. I just always find it meaningful, but especially shaping for me this week. And they ask 2 questions, and I isolate them for you. And the first one is very much like what I asked the children, and that is, what do you understand the word Sabbath to mean? What is Sabbath for you? John Ryder on the podcast said, well, it's more than Sunday for me. Even in my own journey, he said, it's about a commandment, but it's also about a space for rest and reflection and creativity. We hear, as John read it from Deuteronomy, the commandment to keep the Sabbath, to honor it, but in it, there is space for rest and reflection and creativity, and about creating, John said, some balance in life. It's a pause in a moment reflecting intentionally on God's gift and goodness, and that pause, that weekly pause, nurtures gratitude and renews our humanity. That's what you said. It makes us more human again, in the best sense of that, for the task that God is calling us to in the week ahead. What does Sabbath mean to you? Sarah Mickelson said, it's about a time of returning together. The highlight of Sabbath she lifted up was lunch. Sunday lunch, which she associates with gathering with family or friends, whether it's big or small, lunch together, nurturing bodies with food, but also friendship and families. It restores identity, she says, to have that Sabbath connection again of who we are and our relationship with each other. Bill Hall talked about, when asked, what does Sabbath mean to you? He talked about the journey in his own life from being a boy to now being a retired adult, the movement from Sabbath being a thou shalt not. As a boy, he experienced it in the shall not commandment part, things that they weren't supposed to do. Some of you may remember that yourselves at an earlier time in your lives. We didn't shop on Sundays. We didn't, at least in my Sabbatarian experience, we didn't go to the movies on Sunday. I had to wait like 3 days longer than the rest of my friends to see the first James Bond movie because I couldn't go see it on Sundays, right? It was set apart with things that we didn't do, and now culture doesn't respect that in the same way. But Bill said it moved from him as a boy to thou shalt not to becoming a way of understanding renewal and restoring life. Now he said it's about nurture. It's about something we're given rather than just a shall not. Interesting, in the Deuteronomy text where that one Ten Commandment is read today, the basis for the full memory of the Sabbath is, do you remember it? It's right there, and we read the basis for the memory of it is their experience with slavery. Remember, says Deuteronomy, you were slaves once. It's about compassion. You remember what it was like to work without rest. Remember that and keep the Sabbath, because the Sabbath isn't just about your own renewal and rest, but it's about the renewal and rest of your household and all who work with you and for you, even the creatures, even the animals in your influence. They shall know Sabbath and rest too. It starts with that memory of the labor of others and your own labor, and it elicits empathy regarding their work. The Sabbath practices mercy. It makes us practice mercy. It reorients us towards being merciful that way. You know what's a frequent evaporator, a frequent diminisher of mercy in my character? Fatigue. I'm much less likely to be merciful if I'm tired. I'm much less kind when I'm really fatigued. Sabbath may not be just about nurturing me, but about God having mercy on those who have to live with me. Indeed, it's a gift to the community, right? So that's the one term, before we read the text, Sabbath, that I wanted you to think about. And there's another term, especially older adults. Again, I ask you, some of the young people may have heard this too, but anybody heard the term showbread before? Showbread, it's spelled in English Shewbread, all right? That's the King James English translation of the way the word is translated, bread of the presence, all right? Bread of the presence. And I wouldn't be surprised if you're not familiar with that, but the bread of the presence is mentioned here in the gospel lesson. It's a a collection of loaves of bread or cakes. There's 12 of them. And they're always kept in the temple on a special table in a special spot, always in the north end of the temple. And they're out there day and night, a new set of loaves each week. And they represent an offering of God's faithfulness in providing for the people. But the showbread, the bread of the presence, it's the presence of God, it also represents the people's bringing forward their gifts to God, the fruits of their work and their labor. And so you'll hear the term, the bread of presence, which is about the manifestation of the presence of God in mercy and feeding here in this text today. And Abiathar, he was the high priest at a particular time in the life of Israel here. So let's hear the first part of this gospel reading from chapter 2, 23. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisee said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest, and he ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and he gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." The power of the commandment is very clear here. The power of the commandment in your memory of Sabbath practice, I hope, is clear here, the purpose of it. In the podcast this week, Sarah Mickelson said, this story teaches us, the story from the Gospels, we have this story because the community remembers and wants us to remember how at times strictly keeping the Sabbath can mistakenly become more important than loving a person. In our zeal to keep the Sabbath, we can end up actually defeating its purpose. Bill Hall said, this story, it isn't just about keeping the Sabbath commandment to which Jesus applies the interpretation of love, which is what happens here. Jesus applies the interpretation of love to the Sabbath commandment. It's actually about the interpretation of love being applied to all of the commandments. Across the Gospels, all of the commandments will be interpreted by Jesus through the prism of love. Just as traffic laws, red lights and yield signs and speed limits are not meant simply to restrain us from personal liberty, but to make travel safe for all vehicles and pedestrians, just as traffic laws serve that way, Jesus teaches that the commandments are not meant simply to limit, but meant to free people for life, to bless their living. The Pharisees here have distorted the commandments, and they're illustrative of our own temptation. The Pharisees have created rules and interpretation that then end up thwarting the purpose of the commandment. In plucking some grain from the fields in this story, his disciples are not breaking the provision of resting from work. They're simply getting something to eat. John Ryder said that. Jesus then tells them the story, another Bible story. He tells the Pharisees the story of King David, whom the Bible describes as a man after God's own heart, all right? The best of people. King David made an exception to the Sabbath commandment. He ate himself and let his friends have some of the bread that was there too. In the Gospels, what is the guiding standard for the interpretation of the commandments? It's mercy. That's what we're being taught here in Mark's Gospel. Mercy is the guiding rule, the rail along the side of the road. It's mercy that's meant to be the interpretive prism for all of the commandments. What does our adherence to the form of the law, to righteousness strictly, keep us from the intention of the commandment? When does that happen? whenever the commandment keeps us from loving our neighbor. And then to illustrate this profoundly, the Gospel of Mark remembers a very specific example next. It's an illustration of what Jesus has just taught them. Reading now from the verses that follow in chapter 3, verse 1. Again, Jesus entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come forward." Then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. The healing story moves the moment from a moment of debate to a practical engagement. The gospel story, this shows us how God is present. It shows us that God is powerful, and it shows us especially that God is merciful love, present powerfully as merciful love. And that's the good news for you today. That's the good news for you. I say that quite intentionally, thinking of your different situations, your different contexts across the journey this summer and in your lives at this point. This is good news for you. Whatever you are dealing with, and I don't say that lightly, Jesus has shown us God is present. Jesus has shown us God is powerful. Jesus shows us here that God is merciful love. And that culminates in the resurrection when Jesus encounters death. God is present, powerful, and present as merciful love.